This is an example of a chi-square test of independence using SPSS. Let's imagine that we have the following question with the following data. Imagine that Denison's first-year office wants to know whether attending a pre-orientation trip in August is associated with a sense of flourishing at the end of the first year. So they've asked a simple question at the end of the first year for every first-year student. Did you attend a pre-orientation trip before your first year of college? This would be something like an AUGO trip, the outdoor orientation, service orientation, etc. And students could simply answer yes or no. They also asked the following question. Do you feel you're flourishing at Denison? Yes or no? Well, notice that both of these questions could be asked in a different way that might not give us this categorical dichotomous data. But since they are asked this way, then a chi-square test of independence would be the best approach for analyzing this kind of a question. The null hypothesis in this case would be a non-relationship. So in this case, we'd expect there's no relationship between attending pre-orientation and flourishing at Denison. That's what we're trying to evaluate and potentially reject. Our alternative hypothesis, or really the reason why we're doing the study, is because we expect that perhaps there is a relationship between attending a pre-orientation and flourishing at the end of your first year. Specifically, we think the direction that this relationship goes is that if you attend a pre-orientation, you're more likely to report that you're flourishing. So you might also see this test of independence listed as a Pearson chi-square. They're referencing the same kind of test. So when we go into SPSS, our example data set involves orientation and flourishing. Let's take a look at this from the variable view. The orientation variable has two values. 0 is no and 1 is yes. And this is a nominal variable because it's a category. The flourishing variable also has 0 for no and 1 for yes. Now that we know that, we're going to do our analysis. We're going to analyze descriptive statistics, crosstabs, and when we get into crosstabs, we see an opportunity to put a variable in the row and a variable in the column. It doesn't really matter which way we go. It will just orient the data one direction or the other. So for this example, let's put orientation in the row and flourishing in the column. This will set up a square of frequencies similar to how we would do it by hand or in Excel. Now we're going to ask for statistics. The statistic that we are interested in is the chi-square. We also would like to get the effect size so that we don't have to calculate it by hand and ask for the Cramer's V or the phi. Within the cells, we might be interested in percentages. So not just frequencies, but percentages as well. So let's go ahead and ask for the percentages by row. And if we want to do two things at once, we can ask for the clustered bar charts to show up also in our output, so we don't have to make them in the bar chart creator separately. So just as a recap, we asked for the chi-square in statistics, we asked for percentages in the cells, and we also asked to display clustered bar charts. So let's take a look at what we see. Okay. Within the crosstab, we see orientation is on the row and flourishing is on the column. Again, we could have put them in the opposite order if it's easier or more intuitive to see it the other way around. Notice that of the 40 people who didn't attend an orientation, 29 of them said that they were not flourishing and 11 said that they were. In percentages, 72% of those individuals reported that they were not flourishing and 27% reported that they were. Alternately, among the 20 people who did attend an orientation, 13 out of the 20 reported that they were flourishing, and 7 out of the 20 reported they were not. And here are their corresponding percentages. So we can look at this and say, it seems as though more people in the orientation groups are flourishing than are not. And alternately, people who are not attending orientation, more of them are not flourishing than are. What we don't know is whether that represents a significant difference relative to chance. Here we have to go to the Pearson chi-square to evaluate the value, the degrees of freedom, and the p-value, or probability level. So in this case, what we see is a chi-square value of 7.8 with 1 degree of freedom. And most importantly for us, we're looking here to see whether the probability of having this kind of a proportion is lower or higher than, say, 5%. So if we have a probability of 0.05 as our cutoff, we see this probability is 0.005, which means it's very, very unlikely that we would get this different of a proportion for the two groups just by chance. So this lets us reject our null hypothesis that there's no relationship, and instead support the hypothesis that there is a relationship between attending pre-orientation and flourishing. If we look here at our effect size value, we see that the phi squared value is 0.36. We can interpret that as 36% of the variance in flourishing can be accounted for by whether someone attended orientation or not. Alternately, we could look at it the other way around, that 36% of the likelihood of attending orientation is predicted by flourishing. It doesn't really make sense to do it that way, since according to time, orientation comes first and flourishing would come second. Down below we see our bar chart, and this gives us another way to orient ourselves to the results. So here we have people who did attend orientation and people who didn't. And notice that in the orientation group, the yes, I'm flourishing is higher than the no, I'm not. And in the didn't attend orientation group, the I'm not flourishing is higher than the I am flourishing group. Again, remember this is all fictional data, so this actually doesn't represent any truth to current Denison students and whether or not they attended orientation. We also might think about the design of this kind of a study and whether or not we could really conclude that orientation causes flourishing, or whether we have to use some caution in the way that we interpret that result. So think about that and reflect a little on your own about the design and how it relates to the statistic that we just chose.